in the snowbound isolation of Blackthorn Hall, a scream pierces the stormy night, and Lady Beatrice Haverford is found dead, poisoned in a locked room, her secrets buried in a hidden cache of letters. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose quiet demeanour hides a razor-sharp mind. As the snow traps a cast of suspects, grieving daughter, desperate husband, charming artist, and a doctor with too many secrets, Miss Marple unravels a web of blackmail, betrayal, and hidden love. Every clue, from a smudged window to a misplaced key, points to a truth as chilling as the winter itself. Will she uncover the killer before the snow melts? Or will the Manor's dark secrets remain buried forever? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn Hall. The snow descended in relentless feathery drifts, cloaking the village of Thornfield in a silence so profound it seemed the world held its breath. In her neat, unassuming cottage on the edge of the village, Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The room was a study in quiet order. A small table with a lace doily, a vase of winter roses, and a bookshelf heavy with well-thumbed volumes. The only sound, save the click of her needles, was the soft hiss of the kettle on the hob, promising tea to ward off the chill. It was late afternoon when the postman, red-nosed and bundled against the storm, delivered a letter that stood out from the usual bills and circulars. The envelope was of thick, creamy stock, embossed with the crest of Blackthorn Hall, and addressed in a flowing hand that Miss Marple recognized at once. She slit it open with a paper knife, her movements precise, and unfolded the letter within. It was from Lady Beatrice Haverford, a friend from her youth at a finishing school in Florence, where they had shared confidences over cups of cocoa and dreams of grand futures. The letter invited Miss Marple to Blackthorn Hall for a weekend gathering, a small, cheerful party to banish the gloom of this endless winter. The words were warm, but Miss Marple's keen eyes, sharp as ever behind her spectacles, detected a faint undercurrent of strain, a hint of something unsaid. She laid the letter aside, her fingers resuming their dance with the wool. Beatrice had always been a vibrant soul, quick to laugh and quicker to forgive. But her marriage to Sir Reginald Haverford, a man of booming voice and uncertain temper, had dimmed her sparkle. Miss Marple had not seen her in years, their acquaintance sustained only by occasional letters. Why now, she wondered, this sudden summons? Her instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of village life, stirred. She resolved to accept, if only to satisfy her curiosity. By Friday, the storm had thickened, turning the roads to Thornfield into treacherous ribbons of ice. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible wool coat and a scarf knitted in her own precise stitches, was driven to Blackthorn Hall, Zerdugiert. Local taxi driver who muttered about the folly of travel in such weather. The manor loomed ahead, its Georgian facade stern and imposing, its many windows aglow with golden light that pierced the snowy dusk. The driveway was a tunnel through the drifts, and Miss Marple noted the tyre tracks, already filling with fresh snow, suggesting recent arrivals. The butler, Grayson, greeted her at the door, his stooped frame and lined face betraying years of service. He took her coat with a murmur of welcome, and led her through a marble-floored hall, its walls adorned with portraits of stern Haverford ancestors. The drawing-room was a haven of warmth, its fire crackling fiercely, casting shadows on the damask wallpaper. Lady Beatrice rose to greet her, her smile bright but brittle, like porcelain on the verge of cracking. "Jane, my dear," she said, clasping Miss Marple's hands, "how good of you to come in this dreadful weather." The other guests were already present, arranged about the room like figures in a carefully staged tableau. Sir Reginald Haverford, broad-shouldered and ruddy, stood by the mantel, a glass of brandy in hand, his laugh loud but hollow. His daughter Celia, sat on a velvet settee, her delicate features drawn, her fingers twisting a handkerchief into knots. Major Ernest Caldwell, a retired soldier with a weathered face and a penchant for whiskey, occupied an armchair, his eyes darting restlessly. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, a widow with a sharp tongue and sharper eyes, perched on a chair, her black dress a stark contrast to the room's warmth. Felix Warrender, a young artist with tousled hair and an easy smile, leaned against a bookcase, sketching idly in a notebook. The final guest, Dr. Hugh Armitage, arrived a moment later, shaking snow from his coat and apologizing for his tardiness, his manner calm but distracted. Dinner was served in a dining room of polished mahogany and glittering crystal, the table laden with roast pheasant and winter vegetables. Yet the meal was strained, the conversation faltering like a candle in a draught. Sir Reginald's anecdotes about his hunting days were met with polite murmurs, while Mrs. Trent's pointed remarks about modern morals drew tight smiles. Celia barely touched her food, her eyes fixed on her plate, and Felix's attempts at charm fell flat. Dr. Armitage spoke little, though his gaze lingered on Beatrice, who seemed to shrink under it. Miss Marple, seated at the far end, ate sparingly, her attention not on the food, but on the faces around her. She noticed the way Beatrice's hand trembled as she lifted her wineglass, the way Sir Reginald's joviality seemed forced, the way Celia glanced at Felix with a mixture of longing and fear. As the meal ended and the guests retired to the drawing-room for coffee, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes catching a small detail, a silver tray on a sideboard, holding a single cocoa cup, its rim faintly stained. She filed the observation away, her mind already weaving the threads of the evening into a pattern. Something was amiss at Blackthorn Hall. She was certain of it. A discord that went beyond the storm raging outside. As she joined the others by the fire, her knitting in her lap, she felt the familiar prickle of anticipation. Whatever secrets lay hidden in this snowbound manor, she would unravel them, one stitch at a time. Chapter 2. The scream in the night. The storm that enveloped Blackthorn Hall had grown into a tempest by the time the clock struck midnight, its ferocity shaking the ancient panes and sending gusts of icy air whistling through unseen crevices. Miss Jane Marple, ever a light sleeper, had retired to her room on the second floor, a cosy chamber with heavy drapes and a four-poster bed that creaked faintly under her slight frame. She had not yet succumbed to sleep, her mind too occupied with the undercurrents she had sensed at dinner, the tight smiles, the averted glances, the silences that spoke louder than words. Instead, she sat by the window, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, watching the snow swirl in chaotic patterns against the moonlit sky. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, the needle silent for once, as she pondered the peculiar tension that hung over the house like a fog. It was then that the scream pierced the night, a sharp, anguished cry that cut through the howling wind and sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. It was not the wail of the storm, nor the creak of the old manor settling. It was unmistakably human, raw with terror. She rose at once, her movements brisk despite her age, and reached for her dressing gown. Tying it securely, she took her small torch from the bedside table and stepped into the corridor, her slippers whispering against the polished floorboards. The hallway was dark, save for the faint glow of a single wall sconce that flickered as the wind battered the house. Miss Marple moved cautiously, her torch casting a narrow beam ahead. She had not gone far when she encountered Celia Haverford, emerging from her own room at the far end of the corridor. The young woman's face was ghostly pale, her dark hair loose and tangled, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched the banister as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Miss Marple!" Celia's voice was a tremulous whisper. "Did you hear it? That scream! It came from downstairs. I think it was Mother." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's arm, noting the trembling that seemed to shake her entire frame. "Now, my dear, let us stay calm," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of one accustomed to soothing frayed nerves. "We shall go and see what has happened. Stay close to me." Together they descended the grand staircase, its oak steps creaking under their weight. The hall below was dim, the chandelier unlit, but a faint glow spilled from the drawing-room, where the fire had burned low. As they approached, the door swung open, and Grayson, the butler, appeared, his usually impeccable demeanour frayed. His thin face was drawn, and his hands fumbled with the candlestick he carried. "Miss Marple, Miss Celia," he said, his voice unsteady. "I heard a cry, something dreadful. I was just coming to investigate." "Lead the way, Grayson," Miss Marple said, her tone firm but kind. The trio entered the drawing-room, where the embers in the grate cast eerie shadows across the ornate wallpaper. There, slumped in a high-backed armchair by the fireplace, was Lady Beatrice Haverford, her head lolled to one side, her hands resting limply in her lap, and her eyes stared blankly into the void. The air held a faint, acrid scent, almost imperceptible beneath the lingering aroma of wood smoke. Celia let out a choked sob and rushed to her mother's side, but Miss Marple, with a gentle but firm hand, held her back. "Wait, my dear," she murmured. "We must not disturb anything." Her sharp eyes took in the scene. The overturned teacup on the side table, its contents staining the lace doily, the half-empty decanter of brandy nearby, and the heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly across the windows, shutting out the storm. Within moments the rest of the household began to gather, roused by the commotion. Sir Reginald Haverford stormed in, his dressing-gown hastily tied, his ruddy face flushed with alarm. "What the devil's going on?" he bellowed, then stopped short at the sight of his wife. "Beatrice, good God, what's happened?" Major Ernest Caldwell followed, his eyes bleary and his shirt untucked, a glass of whisky still clutched in one hand. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, her hair in curlers beneath a silk scarf, entered with a dramatic gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Felix Warrender, the young artist, slipped in quietly, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes flickering over the scene. Last to arrive was Dr. Hugh Armitage, his medical bag in hand, his face composed but pale. He knelt beside Lady Beatrice, his fingers deftly searching for a pulse. The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the dying fire and the distant moan of the wind. "She's dead," Dr. Armitage said at last, his voice low and steady. He leaned closer, his brow furrowing as he inhaled. "Now, there's a faint smell. Bitter almond, I suspect cyanide." A collective gasp rippled through the group. Sir Reginald staggered back, his hand clutching the back of a chair for support. "Poison! Impossible! Who would do such a thing?" His voice was a mixture of grief and outrage. But Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the others, as though searching for a culprit. Mrs. Trent clutched her pearls, her lips pursed in a thin line. "This is utterly barbaric," she declared. "Poison in a respectable house like this? It's unthinkable." Major Caldwell took a long swig from his glass, his hand trembling. "Damned queer business," he muttered, his words slurring slightly. Felix remained silent, standing near the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. Celia, now weeping quietly, clung to Miss Marple's arm, her frail form shaking with sobs. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, stepped back to observe the group. Her eyes lingered on each face, noting the subtle shifts in expression. The way Sir Reginald's bluster seemed to mask something deeper. The way Mrs. Trent's indignation carried a hint of relish. The way Felix's silence felt calculated. Dr. Armitage, rising from his examination, met her gaze briefly, and she saw a flicker of unease in his otherwise calm demeanour. Constable Phipps must be informed, Miss Marple said quietly, breaking the tense silence. Though I fear the snow will delay him until morning. Sir Reginald nodded brusquely. Grayson, see to it. Send someone to the village at first light. The butler bowed and retreated, his candle casting long shadows as he left. The guests began to disperse, their murmurs of shock and suspicion trailing behind them. Miss Marple lingered, her torch sweeping over the room once more. She noted the locked windows, the heavy bolts undisturbed, and the key in the door turned from the inside. A locked room, it seemed, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. In her experience, locks could be manipulated, and secrets were rarely as secure as they seemed. As she returned to her room, Celia's soft voice followed her. Miss Marple, do you think someone in this house did this? Miss Marple paused, her kind eyes meeting the girl's frightened ones. My dear, she said gently, people are capable of many things when they believe they have no other choice. But we shall find the truth, I promise you. Alone in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window once more. Her knitting resumed, the needles clicking in a steady rhythm. The storm raged on, but her mind was calm, already piecing together the fragments of the night, the scream, the locked room, the bitter almond scent. Somewhere in Blackthorn Hall, she knew, lay the answer, hidden in the shadows of human nature, waiting for her to uncover it. Chapter 3. The Locked Room. The snow continued to fall relentlessly over Blackthorn Hall, transforming the manor into an isolated fortress, its walls cocooned in a silence broken only by the occasional groan of the wind. By morning, the roads to Thornfield Village were impassable, the drifts piling high against the gates. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her neat tweed skirt and cardigan, sat in the morning room, her knitting needles clicking softly as she sipped a cup of tea. The events of the previous night hung heavily in the air, and the household moved with the sluggish unease of those awaiting calamity. Constable Phipps, a young man with an earnest face and a slightly too large uniform, had braved the storm on foot, arriving just as the breakfast trays were cleared. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his boots left damp patches on the polished floor as he was ushered into the drawing-room, where Lady Beatrice's body had been respectfully covered with a sheet. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, positioned herself near the doorway, her sharp eyes missing nothing as Phipps began his investigation. "This is a proper puzzle, isn't it?" Phipps said, scratching his head as he surveyed the room. "A locked room mystery, plain as day. Windows bolted, door locked from the inside, key still in the lock. No one could have got in or out without being seen." Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment, her lips pursing slightly. "Indeed, Constable," she said mildly, "it does appear so. But appearances, you know, can be deceptive." Phipps glanced at her, his expression a mix of respect and uncertainty. He was new to his post, and the presence of a dead aristocrat in a snowbound manor was clearly beyond his usual duties. He turned to the guests who had gathered reluctantly, their faces a tableau of grief, suspicion, and barely concealed irritation. Sir Reginald Haverford, his eyes red-rimmed but his posture rigid, was the first to be questioned. "Beatrice and I had our disagreements," he admitted gruffly, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "She wanted to sell that blasted painting in the gallery, a Haverford heirloom, worth a fortune. I told her it was out of the question. We argued about it last night, before she retired, but I'd never harm her. Never." Miss Marple noted the way his voice cracked on the last word, though whether from grief or guilt she could not yet say. Her eyes drifted to Celia, who stood by the window twisting a handkerchief in her hands. When Phipps turned to her, the girl's voice was barely audible. "Mother was restless last night," she said. "I heard her pacing in her room, long after dinner. She was muttering something about secrets that must stay buried. I didn't understand what she meant." Major Ernest Caldwell, slouched in an armchair with a glass of soda water to steady his nerves, claimed he had been asleep when the scream rang out. "Dead to the world," he mumbled, though Miss Marple observed the faint tremor in his hands and the stale scent of whiskey that clung to him. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, her lips painted a vivid red despite the hour, was more forthcoming. "That artist, Felix Warrender," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "He's not to be trusted. Always skulking about, asking questions about poor Beatrice's past. I wouldn't be surprised if he's mixed up in this." Felix, leaning against the mantelpiece, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing in his defense. When pressed, he admitted to sketching in the library until midnight, alone. "I heard nothing unusual," he said smoothly, his dark eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment before sliding away. Dr. Hugh Armitage, calm and professional, confirmed his earlier observation. "The smell of bitter almonds suggests cyanide," he said, his voice steady. "It was likely in her cocoa. She always took a cup before bed. The poison acts quickly, within minutes." He hesitated, then added, "I checked on her earlier in the evening, around 10. She seemed preoccupied, but perfectly well." Miss Marple listened intently, her needles resuming their rhythmic dance. The cocoa, she noted, had been prepared in the kitchen, where any of the household could have accessed it. The locked room, however, was the puzzle that intrigued her most. She excused herself quietly and made her way to the drawing-room, where Phipps was still examining the scene. The windows, heavy with frost, were indeed bolted, their latches stiff with age. The door's lock was sturdy, the key still in place, but something about the arrangement nagged at her. Stepping closer to the side table, she examined the spilled cocoa cup, its contents now a dark stain on the doily. Beside it lay a small brass key, half hidden by a fold of fabric. She bent to inspect it, careful not to touch, and realized it was not the door key but a smaller one, perhaps to a drawer or cabinet. "Curious," she murmured, straightening up. "Constable, have you noted this key?" Phipps blinked, then hurried over, his notebook at the ready. "Missed that, Miss Marple," he admitted, jotting it down. "Could be important, though I don't see what it unlocks." "Perhaps nothing in this room," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the furniture. "But it tells us someone was careless, or wanted us to believe they were." As Phipps continued his inquiries, Miss Marple slipped into the corridor, her mind turning over the details. A locked room was a clever trick, but she had seen such tricks before. In the village of Chipping Norton, where a supposedly sealed attic had concealed a murderer's escape, or in the case of old Mrs. Hargreaves, whose locked study had been anything but. People, she reflected, were so predictable in their desire to deceive, yet so careless in their execution. She returned to the morning room, where the guests had dispersed, their voices echoing faintly from other parts of the house. Celia sat alone, staring out at the snow, her face etched with grief. Miss Marple took a seat beside her, her voice gentle. "My dear, tell me about your mother's habits. Did she always lock the drawing-room door at night?" Celia shook her head. "Not always. She liked to sit there late, reading or writing letters. But last night she seemed anxious. She told me to go to bed early, said she needed to think." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away this detail. An anxious woman, a locked room, a hidden key, and a cup of poisoned cocoa. Each piece was a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. She patted Celia's hand reassuringly. "We shall get to the bottom of this, my dear. Truth has a way of rising, like cream, in a jug." As she resumed her knitting, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the key, the cocoa, and the secrets Celia had overheard. Someone in Blackthorn Hall had wanted Lady Beatrice silenced, and they had chosen a method both cruel and cunning. But Miss Marple knew that even the cleverest criminals left traces, small human traces, that could unravel their schemes. And she intended to find them. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Motive. The snowbound isolation of Blackthorn Hall seemed to tighten its grip on the household as the day wore on, the heavy silence broken only by the creak of floorboards and the occasional clatter from the kitchen. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm in her hands, moved quietly through the manor, her unassuming presence allowing her to blend into the background like a familiar piece of furniture. She had always found that people revealed more when they thought themselves unobserved, and in a house rife with suspicion, there were secrets waiting to be overheard. In the morning room, where a weak sun struggled to pierce the frosted windows, Miss Marple settled into a corner with her tea, her ears attuned to the murmured conversations drifting through the open door. Sir Reginald's voice, gruff and strained, carried from the library where he was speaking to Major Caldwell. "The painting's worth a fortune, Ernest," he said, his tone laced with desperation. "Beatrice was adamant we sell it, said it would cover the debts. But it's been in the family for generations. I couldn't let it go." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. Debts, she thought, were a powerful motive, especially for a man as proud as Sir Reginald. She recalled his flushed face at dinner, the way his laughter had rung a touch too loud, as though masking some deeper worry. She made a mental note to inquire further about the Haverford finances. Her attention shifted as Celia passed by the doorway, her steps hesitant. The girl had been hovering near her mother's rooms all morning, as though drawn by some unspoken need. Miss Marple rose and followed at a discreet distance, her slippers silent on the thick rugs. In the upstairs corridor, she found Celia lingering outside a small study, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Miss Marple," Celia said, startled, her eyes red from crying. I just wanted to feel close to her." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, her keen eyes noting the girl's nervous fidgeting. "Did your mother often use this room?" Celia nodded. "She wrote her letters here. It was her private place where she could think." Her voice broke, and she looked away. She was so worried lately, about father, about money, about everything. Miss Marple patted her arm, her mind cataloguing the information. A worried woman, a private study, and a family on the brink of financial ruin. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern. She excused herself and continued her quiet exploration. Her steps leading her to the servants' quarters, where she found Grayson, the butler, polishing silver with a distracted air. "Grayson," she said, her voice warm but probing, "you've been with the Haverfords many years, haven't you? You must know the household well." The butler's hands stilled, and he gave a cautious nod. 20 years, miss. I've seen a fair bit." "And Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational. "Was she often troubled, do you think?" Grayson hesitated, then lowered his voice. "She was a kind mistress, but these past months she was uneasy, always checking the post, asking if anyone had been asking for her. I thought it might be to do with that young Mr. Warrender. He's been poking about, asking odd questions." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained mild. "Questions about what, Grayson?" "Her past, miss. Old friends, old places. Things from before she married Sir Reginald. I didn't think much of it. Artists are curious folk, aren't they? But it seemed to upset her." Thanking him, Miss Marple moved on, her mind turning to Felix Warrender. His charm was undeniable, but there was a watchfulness about him, a sharpness that suggested more than idle curiosity. She recalled his fleeting glance in the drawing-room, the way he had stood apart, as though measuring the others. Blackmail, she thought, was not beyond a man like Felix, especially if he had uncovered something Lady Beatrice wished to keep hidden. In the dining room, Mrs. Lavinia Trent was holding court, her voice carrying as she spoke to Major Caldwell. "That Warrender boy," she said, her tone venomous. "He's no better than a common swindler. I heard he was run out of London for some shady dealings, and Beatrice, poor dear, was far too trusting. She should have sent him packing the moment he arrived." Major Caldwell grunted, his glass of whisky never far from his lips. "Beatrice was always soft-hearted," he slurred, "too soft for her own good. But poison? That's a coward's way. Can't see Warrender for it, though. Too slick by half." Miss Marple, lingering near the doorway, noted the Major's unsteady gait and the way his eyes darted nervously, as though he feared saying too much. His war stories, she had observed, were a jumble of contradictions, and his drinking seemed more than a habit. It was a refuge. She wondered what he might be hiding behind his bluster. Later, in the library, Miss Marple found Dr. Armitage reviewing his medical notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. She approached with her usual diffidence, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "Dr. Armitage," she said, "you've been most helpful to poor Constable Phipps. You must see many secrets in your profession." The doctor looked up, his expression guarded but polite. "A physician learns to be discreet, Miss Marple. People confide in us, whether they mean to or not." "Indeed," she said, her eyes twinkling faintly. "And Lady Beatrice, she confided in you, didn't she? About her worries, perhaps?" Dr. Armitage hesitated, his fingers tightening on his pen. "She was concerned about certain matters," he admitted, "family matters mostly. She didn't go into detail, but I could tell she was under strain." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away his careful words. There was something in his demeanour, a studied calm, that reminded her of a vicar she had once known, who had been far too composed when his wife disappeared. She thanked the doctor and moved to the window, where she noticed a faint scratch on the sill, barely visible beneath the frost. It was a small thing, but in Miss Marple's experience, small things often led to larger truths. As the afternoon waned, she returned to the drawing-room, where Constable Phipps was still puzzling over the locked door. She drew his attention to the small brass key she had noticed the previous night, now carefully bagged as evidence. "It may unlock something we haven't yet found," she suggested. "A desk, perhaps, or a box. Secrets, Constable, are often kept in small places." Phipps nodded, his admiration for her growing. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple. I'll have a look round the study." As he left, Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The motives were beginning to take shape. Sir Reginald's debts, Felix's prying, Celia's grief, Mrs. Trent's malice, Major Caldwell's evasions, and Dr. Armitage's reticence. Each was a thread in the tapestry of Blackthorn Hall, and Miss Marple knew that somewhere among them lay the truth about Lady Beatrice's death. She would need only to tug gently at the right thread, and the whole pattern would unravel. Chapter 5. The Painting's Secret. The snow continued to cocoon Blackthorn Hall, its relentless fall muffling the world outside and casting a pall over the Manor's inhabitants. By mid-afternoon, the air inside was thick with unspoken accusations, each guest retreating into their own thoughts, their glances sharp with suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, moved through the house with the quiet grace of a shadow, her unassuming presence allowing her to observe without drawing attention. She had always found that the truth lay not in grand gestures, but in the small overlooked details. The flicker of an eyelid, the catch in a voice, the misplaced object that told a story of its own. After luncheon, a strained affair marked by stilted conversation and the clink of cutlery, Miss Marple suggested a visit to the gallery, where the painting Sir Reginald had mentioned hung in sombre splendour. The group gathered reluctantly, their footsteps echoing in the long, chilly room lined with portraits of stern-faced Haverfords. The painting in question, A dark oil of a 17th-century ancestor glowered from its gilt frame, its subject's eyes seeming to follow the onlookers with disapproval. Miss Marple, her head tilted slightly, studied it with interest, her sharp eyes catching a faint irregularity along the frame's edge. A seam, almost invisible, where the wood met the canvas. "Such a fine piece," she remarked, her voice mild. "Sir Reginald, you said it was a family heirloom. Has it always hung here?" Sir Reginald, his hands clasped behind his back, nodded curtly. "Generations, Miss Marple. Beatrice thought it could fetch enough to ease our troubles. But it's not just about money. It's history, duty." Felix Warrender, standing near the window, gave a low chuckle. "Priceless, but cursed, I'd say. Old paintings like that often hide secrets, don't they?" His tone was light, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes lingered on the frame, as though he knew more than he let on. Celia, hovering near her father, looked uncomfortable, her fingers twisting the hem of her cardigan. "Mother loved this gallery," she said softly. "She used to say the portraits watched over us. I never liked it here. It's too cold." Mrs. Lavinia Trent, her lips pursed, adjusted her shawl with a dramatic shiver. "Cold indeed, and no wonder, with such grim company staring down at us. If you ask me, that painting's more trouble than it's worth." Major Caldwell, nursing a glass of soda water in a vain attempt at sobriety, muttered something about damned nonsense, while Dr. Armitage remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. Miss Marple, undeterred by the group's unease, stepped closer to the painting, her fingers brushing lightly against the frame. To her surprise, it shifted slightly, revealing a faint click. She glanced at Celia, who nodded hesitantly, granting permission. With Sir Reginald's grudging assistance, Miss Marple lifted the heavy frame from its hook, revealing a concealed compartment in the wall behind it. Inside was a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon, their edges yellowed with age. A collective murmur rippled through the group as she carefully extracted them, her hands steady despite the weight of the discovery. "Letters," she said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet authority. "Old ones, by the look of them. Shall we see what they contain?" Sir Reginald's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "Those are private," he snapped. But his protest lacked conviction, and he made no move to stop her. Miss Marple untied the ribbon and scanned the first letter, her expression unchanging though her mind raced. They were love letters, written in a flowing hand, addressed to Beatrice from an unnamed man. The dates placed them years before her marriage to Sir Reginald, their tone ardent but tinged with desperation, hinting at a forbidden romance abruptly ended. Celia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mother! But she never spoke of anyone else. This can't be true." Her voice trembled, and she turned to her father, seeking reassurance, but Sir Reginald's face was a mask of suppressed fury. Mrs. Trent's eyes gleamed with malicious delight. "Well, well," she purred. "Beatrice had her secrets, didn't she? And here we thought she was such a paragon." Major Caldwell coughed, his discomfort palpable, while Felix's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. Dr. Armitage stepped forward, his voice measured. "This is a private matter," he said. "Perhaps we should leave these with the family." Miss Marple, folding the letters carefully, handed them to Celia, who clutched them as though they might burn her. "They may be important, my dear," she said gently, "but we must handle them with care. Secrets, once uncovered, have a way of stirring trouble." As the group dispersed, their whispers trailing like smoke, Miss Marple lingered in the gallery, her eyes returning to the painting. The compartment was a clever hiding place, but not clever enough to escape notice forever. Someone, she reasoned, had known about the letters. someone who might have used them to exert pressure on Lady Beatrice. Blackmail was an ugly word, but it fit the shadows she sensed lurking in Blackthorn Hall. She made her way to the library, where she found Constable Phipps cataloguing his notes. "Constable," she said, her tone conversational, "have you examined the study yet? The small key we found might belong to a desk or cabinet there." Phipps nodded eagerly, grateful for her guidance. "I'll check, Miss Marple. Those letters, do you think they're connected to the murder?" "Everything is connected, Constable," she replied, her eyes twinkling faintly. "The trick is finding how." Alone again, Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The letters were a revelation, but they raised more questions than answers. Had Beatrice hidden them herself? Or had someone else placed them there, knowing they would be found? And who had known of their existence? Felix with his probing questions, Dr. Armitage with his guarded demeanour, or perhaps Sir Reginald, whose pride might have been wounded by his wife's past. She recalled a similar case in the village of Limstock, where a bundle of anonymous letters had set neighbour against neighbour, sowing discord until the truth emerged. People, she thought, were so predictable in their desires, to love, to hide, to protect, but they were equally predictable in their mistakes, leaving clues in their haste to cover their tracks. As the afternoon light faded, casting long shadows across the gallery, Miss Marple's mind turned to the cocoa cup, the locked room, and the faint scratch on the windowsill she had noticed earlier. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and the letters were another. She would need to tread carefully, for the truth was close, and someone in Blackthorn Hall was watching, waiting for her to make a misstep. But Miss Marple, with her quiet, wisdom, and unerring instinct, was not one to falter. Chapter 6. The Doctor's Confession. The snow, which had fallen without pause for 2 days, began to slow as evening descended on Blackthorn Hall, its relentless curtain parting to reveal a sky heavy with stars. Inside, the Manor's atmosphere grew ever more stifling, the weight of Lady Beatrice's death pressing upon the guests like a physical force. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting a constant companion, sat by the fire in the morning room, her eyes half closed but her mind alert, sifting through the fragments of conversation and observation she had gathered. The discovery of the letters had stirred the household, and she sensed that the truth, like the snow outside, was beginning to settle into a clearer shape. The day had been one of uneasy silences and furtive glances, with each guest retreating to their own corner of the manor as though to escape the growing suspicion. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of letting the threads of the mystery slip through her fingers. She had noted Dr. Hugh Armitage's guarded demeanour, the way his calm professionalism seemed to mask a deeper unease. His role as the family physician gave him access to secrets others might never suspect, and his hesitation when questioned about Lady Beatrice's worries had not escaped her notice. After dinner, a subdued affair where even Mrs. Trent's barbed remarks lacked their usual venom, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Armitage in the library. He was seated at a desk, his medical bag open, sorting through papers with a distracted air. The firelight cast shadows across his face, accentuating the lines of strain around his eyes. Miss Marple approached quietly, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, her expression one of gentle concern. "Dr. Armitage," she began, her voice soft but carrying that quiet authority that compelled attention. "You've been so very kind to assist in this dreadful business. It must be difficult, knowing the family as well as you do." The doctor looked up, his hands pausing over his papers. "It's a tragedy, Miss Marple," he said, his tone measured. "Beatrice was a good woman, and to see her taken like this, it's unthinkable." Miss Marple settled into a chair opposite him, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Indeed," she said, her eyes meeting his with a disarming warmth. "And yet, You knew her better than most, I think. She confided in you, didn't she? About those letters, perhaps?" Dr. Armitage's fingers tightened on the pen he held, a fleeting gesture that Miss Marple noted with interest. He hesitated, then set the pen down, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You're a perceptive woman, Miss Marple," he said at last, his voice low. "Yes, Beatrice spoke to me about the letters. Years ago, when I first came to Thornfield, she told me of a youthful indiscretion, an affair, before her marriage to Sir Reginald. It ended badly, and she swore me to secrecy. She was terrified the letters would come to light and ruin her family's name." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged though her mind was racing. "And recently," she pressed gently, "did she mention them again? Was she afraid someone had found them?" The doctor's eyes flickered with unease, and he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "She did," he admitted. "A few weeks ago, she came to me, agitated. She said someone had been asking questions about her past. Hints, nothing direct, but enough to make her fear blackmail. She wouldn't say who, but I suspected." He trailed off, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. "Felix Warrender," she supplied, her voice soft but certain. Dr. Armitage nodded, his face grim. "He came to me last week, asking odd questions about Beatrice's time in London before her marriage. He had that sly way about him, as though he knew more than he was saying. I warned Beatrice, told her to be careful. I thought he might be trying to extort money from her, but I never imagined." His voice broke, and he looked away, his composure faltering. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind remained sharp, piecing together the implications. Blackmail was a dangerous game, and Felix's probing suggested he had stumbled upon something valuable. Perhaps the letters themselves. But had he acted on his knowledge, or was he merely a convenient scapegoat? She recalled the small key in the drawing room, the scratch on the windowsill, and the poisoned cocoa, each a clue pointing to a calculated act. Dr. Armitage's confession, while revealing, did not fully explain the mechanics of the crime, and she sensed he was holding something back. "You cared for her, didn't you?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. "More than a doctor for a patient, perhaps?" Dr. Armitage's face flushed, and he rose abruptly, pacing to the window. "I respected her deeply," he said, his voice tight. "She was a friend, nothing more. But I couldn't bear to see her tormented by fear. If Felix was threatening her, I might have confronted him, but I swear I had no part in her death." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Of course, Doctor," she said soothingly. "But fear can drive people to desperate acts, can it not? And secrets once uncovered have a way of poisoning more than just the heart." She excused herself, leaving Dr. Armitage to his thoughts, and made her way to the drawing-room, where Constable Phipps was still puzzling over the locked door. She found him examining the windows, his notebook filled with scribbled observations. "Miss Marple," he said, brightening at her approach, "I've checked the study, like you suggested. That small key fits a locked drawer in Lady Beatrice's desk. Nothing inside but some old receipts and a diary, though. Nothing about those letters." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "A diary, you say? That might be worth a look, Constable. People often write what they dare not say aloud." As Phipps hurried off to retrieve the diary, Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her gaze lingering on the spot where Lady Beatrice had been found. The doctor's confession had confirmed her suspicions about the letters, but it also raised new questions. Had Felix indeed attempted blackmail, or was Dr. Armitage deflecting blame? And what of the others? Sir Reginald's financial woes, Celia's nervous devotion, Mrs. Trent's spiteful glee, or Major Caldwell's drunken evasions? Each had a motive, however faint, and the locked room remained a puzzle. its secrets hidden in plain sight. She recalled a case in the village of Danemouth, where a seemingly devoted friend had concealed a betrayal behind a mask of loyalty. People, she thought, were so predictable in their passions, yet so clever in their deceptions. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's mind turned to the diary, the key, and the faint bitter almond scent that lingered in her memory. The truth was close. She could feel it, like the tug of a stitch about to unravel the entire skein. Chapter 7. The Truth in the Snow. The snow at Blackthorn Hall had ceased its relentless fall by the third morning, leaving the manor in a crystalline hush, the world outside gleaming under a weak sun. The oppressive atmosphere within, however, had only deepened, each guest moving through the corridors with the wariness of those who sense a storm yet to break. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag ever at her side, had spent the morning in quiet observation, her sharp eyes catching the subtle shifts in behaviour, the way Celia avoided her father's gaze, the way Felix's charm seemed to falter under scrutiny, the way Major Caldwell's hands trembled despite his abstinence from whisky. The discovery of the letters and Dr. Armitage's confession had stirred the household, but Miss Marple knew the truth lay not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. After a breakfast marked by strange silences, Miss Marple requested a private audience with Constable Phipps in the library. The young man, his notebook worn from constant use, greeted her with a mixture of relief and deference. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've gone through Lady Beatrice's diary, as you suggested. It's mostly appointments and such, but there's a note from last week. Must speak to H.A. about F.W. That'd be Dr. Armitage and Felix Warrender, I reckon." Could mean she suspected Felix of something. Miss Marple nodded, her expression mild, but her mind alert. "Very good, Constable, but let us return to the drawing-room. There is something there I believe we've overlooked." Together they made their way to the scene of the crime, where the air still held a faint chill despite the fire now burning brightly. Miss Marple directed Phipps to the window, where she had previously noted a faint smudge on the sill. "Look closely, Constable," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "The snow outside is undisturbed, as you noted, but this mark, here just below the latch, suggests the window was opened, if only briefly. The latch itself is loose, easily manipulated with a thin tool from the outside." Phipps knelt to examine the sill, his eyes widening. "By Jove, you're right, Miss Marple. It's faint, but there's a scratch here, too, like someone used a knife or a screwdriver. But how could they get out there without leaving tracks in the snow?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "A ladder, perhaps, or a rope from the upper window. Or perhaps the snow was disturbed and then smoothed over. We mustn't assume the impossible, Constable, only the improbable." She then turned to the door, where the key remained in the lock. "And this," she said, pointing to the small brass key she had found on the side table, now in Phipps's evidence bag. "It was placed to make us believe the room was locked from the inside, but I suspect it was a distraction. The real key, the one that matters, is likely elsewhere." Phipps scribbled furiously, his admiration for her growing. "You think someone staged the locked room to throw us off?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "Now, let us gather the household. I believe it's time to lay our cards on the table." In the drawing-room, the guests assembled, their faces a mixture of curiosity and dread. Sir Reginald stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Celia sat near the window, clutching her mother's diary, her eyes red-rimmed. Mrs. Trent, her lips pursed, adjusted her shawl with a theatrical shiver. Major Caldwell slumped in an armchair, his face pale, while Felix leaned against the wall, his expression guarded. Dr. Armitage, his medical bag at his feet, stood with a calm that seemed increasingly strained. Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively by the side table, began in her quiet, measured way. "This has been a tragic affair," she said, her voice carrying a gentle authority. Lady Beatrice's death was no accident, but a carefully planned act designed to look like a locked-room mystery. Yet, as I've observed, locked rooms are rarely as secure as they seem. She turned to the window, pointing to the smudge and scratch. This window was opened briefly, to create the illusion of an impossible crime. The snow outside was smoothed to hide any tracks. A simple enough trick with a broom or a board. The key in the door was meant to mislead us, but the small brass key, found here on the table, suggests someone entered this room after Lady Beatrice took her cocoa. The group stirred, their eyes darting to one another. Sir Reginald's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple continued, her tone unwavering. The cocoa, prepared in the kitchen, was the vehicle for the poison. Anyone could have tampered with it, but only someone with knowledge of Lady Beatrice's habits would know she took it every night, and only someone with a motive would go to such lengths. Her gaze settled on Felix. "Mr. Warrender, you were asking questions about Lady Beatrice's past, were you not? Questions that suggested you knew of her letters. Letters that could have ruined her reputation." Felix's smile faltered, but he shrugged. "I'm an artist, Miss Marple. I'm curious by nature. I meant no harm." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Dr. Armitage. "And you, Doctor, knew of those letters. You warned Lady Beatrice that someone, perhaps Mr. Warrender, was prying. You cared for her, didn't you? Enough to protect her from scandal, at any cost." Dr. Armitage's composure cracked, his hands clenching. "I told you, Miss Marple, I only wanted to help her. I would never—" "But you did," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through his protest. "You thought Felix was blackmailing her, threatening to expose her past. You believed that by poisoning her cocoa, you could silence her fears and pin the blame on him. The window, the key, all staged to confuse us. But you didn't count on the smudge or the diary, which confirmed your conversation with her." The room fell silent, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Dr. Armitage's face crumpled, and he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I thought I was saving her," he whispered. "She was so afraid, so desperate. I couldn't let her suffer. I put the cyanide in her cocoa, thinking it would be quick, merciful. I staged the room to point to Felix. I'm sorry." Celia let out a sob, and Sir Reginald staggered, his face ashen. Mrs. Trent gasped, her hand flying to her chest, while Felix's expression hardened, though he said nothing. Major Caldwell muttered incoherently, his glass forgotten. Miss Marple stepped back, her work done. "Constable," she said quietly, "I believe you have your man." Phipps, wide-eyed, moved to Dr. Armitage's side, his handcuffs at the ready. As the doctor was led away, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the group, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. The truth, as always, had been there, hidden in the small human details, the smudge, the key, the diary's note. And now it had risen, like snow melting under the sun. Chapter 8. The Quiet Departure. The snow at Blackthorn Hall had begun to thaw by the following morning, the drifts softening under a tentative sun that cast long shadows across the manor's grounds. The oppressive silence that had gripped the household seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a weary resignation, as the truth of Lady Beatrice's death settled over its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag packed and her modest suitcase ready, stood in the hall, adjusting her hat as she prepared to depart. The case was solved, the murderer confessed, but there was no triumph in her quiet demeanour, only the calm satisfaction of a task completed and a wrong laid bare. Constable Phipps, his youthful face still marked by awe at Miss Marple's deductions, had taken Dr. Armitage into custody. the doctor's confession ringing in his ears as he escorted him to the village lockup. The roads, though still treacherous, were passable now, and a police van was expected to arrive by noon to transport the doctor to the county station. Miss Marple, observing the bustle of the servants as they cleared the snow from the drive, reflected on the fragility of human motives, how a misguided act of loyalty could turn to murder in the blink of an eye. In the drawing room, Celia Haverford approached her, her face pale but composed, the diary still clutched in her hands. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I don't know how to thank you. Mother, she deserved better, but at least we know the truth now." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand, her eyes kind but searching. "My dear, the truth is a hard thing, but it's better than living with shadows. You must look after your father now. He'll need you more than ever." Celia nodded, tears brimming but held in check. "I will, and those letters, I'll burn them. Mother wouldn't want them to hurt anyone else." "A wise choice," Miss Marple said, her tone approving. She recalled a similar case in the village of Much Benham, where a cache of old letters had nearly destroyed a family until they were consigned to the flames. Secrets, she thought, were best left to rest once their purpose was served. Sir Reginald emerged from the library, his shoulders stooped, but his manner gruffly courteous. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat, "you've done us a great service, though it's a bitter one. I misjudged Armitage. Thought him a steady sort, not a murderer." "People surprise us, Sir Reginald," Miss Marple replied gently. "Even the best can falter when they believe they're protecting someone they care for." He nodded, his eyes distant, and offered a curt bow before retreating, no doubt to grapple with the wreckage of his family's pride. Mrs. Lavinia Trent, her bags already packed, swept into the hall with a sniff of disapproval. "A dreadful business," she declared, her voice carrying the relish of one who thrived on scandal. "I shall be glad to leave this place. Thornfield will talk of nothing else for years." She departed without a backward glance, her car crunching through the melting snow toward the village. Major Caldwell, sobered by the events, had taken to his room, his usual bluster replaced by a quiet shame. Miss Marple suspected he would leave soon, his war stories no longer sufficient to shield him from his own weaknesses. Felix Warrender, however, was nowhere to be seen. Grayson, the butler, informed her that the young artist had slipped out at dawn, leaving only a brief note claiming urgent business in London. "A slippery one, that Mr. Warrender," Grayson muttered, and Miss Marple agreed, though she doubted Felix had been the mastermind of the crime. His role, she suspected, was that of an opportunist, stirring the pot but not wielding the poison. As she waited for the car to take her to the station, Miss Marple stood by the window, gazing out at the thawing landscape. The snow, once a barrier, now revealed the world beyond. A world that would go on, as it always did, despite the tragedies that unfolded within it. She thought of Dr. Armitage, his calm facade shattered by his confession, and of Lady Beatrice, whose secrets had driven him to such a desperate act. It was a reminder, she mused, of how fragile trust could be, and how quickly love could turn to betrayal. The car arrived, and Grayson helped her with her suitcase, his usual reserve softened by gratitude. "You've a gift, miss," he said quietly. "We'd have been lost without you." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling faintly. "Kindness and observation, Grayson, that's all it takes. People are much the same, whether in a manor or a village." On the train to Thornfield, Miss Marple settled into her seat, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking in their familiar rhythm. She opened her book, a volume of essays she had borrowed from the Manor's library, but her mind wandered to the case, to the small details that had unravelled it. The smudge on the sill, the misplaced key, the diary's cryptic note. Each had been a thread, and she had woven them together with the patience of one who knew that truth, like a good stitch, required care and precision. As the countryside rolled by, its fields emerging from their snowy shroud, Miss Marple reflected on the human heart, its passions, its fears, its capacity for both good and ill. People, she murmured to herself, are so very predictable, yet so very surprising. With that, she turned a page, her thoughts drifting to her garden in Thornfield, where the crocuses would soon bloom, and to the quiet life that awaited her, until the next puzzle called her name.